Hi, I'm David J.A. Cooper, and this is Nova Sapiens The Believers, Chapter 1. Darwin at 6:15 a.m., long before the cataclysm. Ding Xiang's uniformed escort led him through the walkways of a bland office building protected by a dozen automated anti-air cannons. The city's residents carried on their lives as if the military presence was merely another commercial opportunity. But everywhere, Ding Xiang saw in their faces the same calculating bewilderment he felt, the same expanding realization of the nature of the prison from which they'd all just been released. 2,600 kilometers away, his city, Bandung, now faced the same transition. The front had reached its outskirts too, and he wanted to tell them it was okay. But they would find out, even if it took some people days to emerge from hiding. It would be harder for them. Propaganda there had more time to confect and reinforce the narrative, beginning with the terrorist attack in Port Moresby that had somehow metastasized into an expanding island-hopping madness. But propaganda would hold little sway once the battle was actually lost. For people in the city, just as it was in Darwin weeks ago, it would be as if reality flickered a bit, and they would start glimpsing possibilities that were never supposed to exist. They would notice when the polished media voices of the commercial and political status quo switched from speaking to them to speaking about them from a safe distance, and about the rebel atrocities whose falsity they could finally see with their own eyes. They would notice when the ragged survivors of the Civil Guard and the Ministry of Religious Ethics stumbled back to the homes they'd been torn from, often years ago, to tell their stories. He arrived at an open doorway that framed one of the architects of that discovery, a tall woman standing at the opposite side of the conference table wearing a black shirt and jeans. She was Major Lasana Morewe, suddenly one of the most powerful people in the world if you put aside rank and considered what she'd actually done, and hence what she was capable of. The technological apparatus of the rebellion bore her fingerprints. Wei Ding Zhang, she greeted him, smiling and looking up from a cluster of documents of white and grey that sprawled out across the table display. The conference room was dimly lit, untroubled by decoration or even paintwork. Ding Zhang blinked at her from the doorway, fighting the urge to fidget with something. "Major?" he replied awkwardly. "Come in. Good to see you again, and welcome to the small cabal of people I trust on this. The General has sent our special forces off to retrieve something that you're going to want to see, given your background." Ding Xiang nodded and shuffled over to the table. The Major grinned for a moment and tapped a few times on the table's surface, sending one of the white rectangles across to his side. "This comes from the Resistance 30 minutes ago. STI compound north of Bandung. Dr. Hoffman is expecting you. We'll transfer research into military robotics." Only months previously, before the front's swift and frightening advance, Ding Xiang had held a job at Global Defense, the once domineering but now decrepit arms manufacturer. He'd been recruited by the front just over a week ago in a surreal moment that involved a tiny toy-like wheeled robot chasing him down an alley and finally handing him a note. The front wanted people like him, apparently, disaffected defense nerds. But until today, it had all been introductions and a lot of waiting to be useful. Lasana's expression appeared to darken. Ding Xiang had a fleeting sense of the weight of world events pressing on her mind. "Okay," he said, "but don't we already have military robots? Didn't you make them?" The Union and now the front both deployed fleets of autonomous aircraft, land vehicles, and submarines for tactical and strategic purposes. "Not like this one," Lasana said softly. "This one's intelligent. Actually sentient. A cow is sentient." Lasana shrugged. "You know what I mean, like us." Ding Xiang bit his lip at the bland assurance of the impossible, but he began to understand at least where he came in. Global Defense was entrusted with AI research. It was one of a tiny handful of companies to have ever acquired that carefully controlled privilege, disproportionately located in Bandung, of course. They took an axe to the imagination of new employees. The first thing the senior managers told you, with a hint of sadism, was this: AI is a myth. It doesn't work, and never has. Of course, they continued after sensing that doubt had been duly instilled, AI is still tremendously useful. The myth lay in what you might believe it actually was. Real AIs, vehicle control, surveillance, aerial combat systems, were nothing like human minds in machine form. In fact, no form of general AI had ever really happened. Even the educational androids used in schools, despite frontline teaching responsibilities and decades of refinement, were only coarse reproductions of outward human behaviour. A human-like AI? Artificial sapiens a la Homo sapiens? What was the point in the end? You created AI as a tool to complement and extend human intelligence, not to reproduce something that, after all, we already had. Nonetheless, people had tried, such was the intuitive appeal of it. People had tried for 2 centuries or more. The managers had proclaimed to reproduce in technology the breadth and nuance of effortless, everyday human decision-making and creativity. Humanity's own imagination had little trouble picturing another version of itself springing forth almost unaided from sheer technical complexity. That was ignorance and magical thinking. Human intelligence was not inevitable or universal, but accidental and fantastically idiosyncratic. It was not going to suddenly materialize in an episode of concerted tinkering with neural networks. You really want a human-like AI? Then reverse engineer the human brain. Find and study every one of the virtually countless possible synaptic connections. Nobody had even come close. Or so Jingzhang had thought a moment ago. Are you sure? Lasana smiled, her eyes intense, and pointed to the white rectangle in front of Jingzhang. I know why you're skeptical, but they're insistent. Read it. They were very insistent. Jingzhang quickly realized, the last shreds of certainty draining from his mind as his eyes scanned the message. The Resistance had been observing a prototype for years. They thought it was Turing-proof. Developed by Dr. Samuel Hoffman and his team, Lasana continued, apparently in a facility not too far from your old employer. There may have been a connection a few years ago. Never heard of STI? I can't guarantee I've never heard the letters, but no one said anything about this. Lasana shrugged. Our forces are taking Bandung and Jakarta in the next few hours. The Resistance idiots didn't leave us much time to get ourselves together, but hopefully we'll get something out of this research before the rear guard figures out what's going on. The Major insisted that Jingzhang scan through the personnel manifest, but to his disappointment he knew none of the people listed. They had a bizarre assortment of qualifications, mostly unrelated to AI research. Is it dangerous? He asked at last. Living Bandung had the effect of converting any fear of a robot uprising into comedic cynicism. The threat was as cartoonish as the robots themselves, but now... well, that's a complex question, isn't it? Our Resistance contacts assure us that the robot itself, as it currently exists, poses no threat, but we don't know exactly what military potential the technology has. I gather the Resistance wants us to use it. And if the robots turn on their creators? Lasana smirked. If it's going to happen, it's this sort of thing that will do it, Jingzhang protested. We made no promises. We need to see what we're dealing with. The dawn light picked out the cradle of volcanic cones rising above Bandung on all sides, and the sporadic pillars of smoke marking the front's assault on Union forces in the city, 3 months into the first war in 100 years. Captain Paul Canner's twin aircraft, escorted by a heavy drone, flew low over the bright green countryside northeast of the city, crossing blurred streams of refugees flowing around the burnt remains of military hardware. From a paper screen on his lap, Paul watched their target, a walled compound on a hillside perhaps 100 meters across. Union Guard units were closing in. What's our ETA? 5 minutes, sir, the pilot responded. Paul's unit was too far away to get there first. Base Odysseus, Paul said, holding a figure to his collar. Be advised we're going to engage the enemy. Proceed, came the disembodied voice of General Ryan. Paul's troops turned to look at him, making whatever mental preparations they saw fit. Paul continued to observe the feed from one of their high-altitude recon drones running through tactical scenarios in his head. This could become a sort of aerial standoff. Union CI-5T transports had landed a short distance from the compound, and now there were CI-11 gunships too, taking advantage of the front's patchy drone coverage out here and establishing a perimeter. Except, he looked closely, they were facing inwards towards the compound. The feed from the recon drone recorded a blinding flash and then nothing but thick black smoke. God, he muttered, fiddling with the feed to try to see through the smoke. They needed some new tactics. He looked up at the weapons specialist sitting beside the pilot. We need them grounded, he said, and touched his collar again. Troy, FYI, were about to commit the attack drones and hit their transports. He gave a nod to his weapons specialist, who nodded back and flicked several controls. 4 small missile-like drones unclamped from the larger drone, and another 4 from the 2 piloted aircraft. They fell away, then accelerated into diverging trajectories. Paul's craft jolted alarmingly of its own accord, and he put a hand on the ceramic wall. The front's Dragonfly, their multi-role gunship/transport craft, was a crucial factor in their success so far, perhaps second to the drones. It was smaller and less well armed and armoured than its Union counterparts, but also faster and more manoeuvrable. It also came with warning. The entire line was still experimental. The first test flights were the actual mission, launched from their encampments in the Papuan highlands to capture Port Moresby. Before then, it had never really been tested at all, except in simulations. In hiding, there'd simply been nowhere to test. Critical faults were routine, though somehow the toll on the front's troops had been mercifully low. While in operation, the craft had been patched up and tweaked constantly, and with time its inherent idiosyncrasies could at least be understood, if not fixed. But there was always the chance, or perhaps just a feeling amongst those who'd flown that first mission, that the damned things might just abruptly fall apart in the sky. The fast attack drones continued on their paths, positioning for a multiple vector assault. They'd been spotted, and the gunships were taking up defensive positions. Paul looked back at the feed, where the Union troops were cleaning up. They were sifting through the bodies strewn throughout the ruins. They found something. Paul watched as 2 figures, silent and partly shrouded by smoke, lifted one body between them and turned it over. They examined it closely and hauled it back to their transport. The robot. The other troops followed, leaving the blackened remains of the compound and the human dead. Shit, Paul muttered. His attack drones were still a minute away. 2 of the 3 gunships suddenly turned towards Paul's craft in a direct frontal line of attack. Have the drones target the advancing gunships, Paul said, then proceed to the transports. The weapons specialist nodded and made the adjustments. Seconds ticked down. Escorted by the 3rd gunship, the enemy transports had lifted off and were putting distance between themselves and the compound. They would not be outrun by the drones. They were relying instead on a suicidal diversion by the other gunships. 4 enemy drones launched, the weapons specialist advised. The gunships had sent their own autonomous payloads speeding towards Paul's craft. The Union's version was larger and slower, and was at a significant disadvantage even when not outnumbered. Both sets of drones would auto-maneuver and auto-target without any further instruction. Taking humans out of the equation decreased the response time in tight aerial combat. Paul flipped his screen to a broad annotated overview of the skirmish. The opposing drones intercepted each other. Instantly, 3 enemy drones vanished from sight. All friendly drones survived and hit the gunships seconds later, tailed ineffectually by the last remaining enemy drone, which had swung around in pursuit. Both gunships slowed and broke off their attack, and the final enemy drone capitulated to the rear guns of its adversaries. All the attack drones now headed for the fleeing transports and the last intact gunship. Paul's craft approached the wounded gunships. They had landed badly on the volcanic slope, their pilots hastily fleeing the scene. Paul marked their position on the map on his paper screen. Someone would notice and deal with them. Put a few more holes in their armour, he added. The dragonflies fired off a burst of armour-piercing incendiary rounds as they flew overhead. Flashes of plasma ignited inside the gunships, tearing them apart. The Union pilots ducked and fell. They had probably survived. Paul turned his attention to the retreating aircraft. The 3rd gunship peeled away from the other 2 craft. The transports were too slow to keep up. Paul dimly made out a short volley of gunfire directed at the gunship without result. He signalled to the pilot to give him an unencrypted radio channel to the enemy craft. Union aircraft, he announced. We have drones closing on your position. You have no defences. Land and surrender yourselves and your craft, or we will pursue and destroy you. No response. Paul repeated the ultimatum. Without any signal, the enemy transport slowed and landed beside a road a few kilometres from the compound, snaking through villages and plantations. The feed showed a moving mass of refugees, children and families, frightened and weary, negotiating a jewelled ribbon of gridlocked cars. There was no direct evidence of fighting here, no wounds, no debris. But the exodus of so many, with no possessions but their clean, bright clothing, told of something terrifying, a hint of hysterical propaganda of a government-facing revolution. We could lose them, Paul said, but they'll have to leave the robot behind. Reacquire the attack drones and monitor the last gunship. The third CI-11 still had its 2 drones, but having deserted, it was already lost to the Union. That problem could work itself out for now. Paul radioed to the other Dragonfly. Troy, secure the compound and recover anything you can. We'll continue to the transports. Okay, Odysseus. Paul watched the transports carefully. They'd landed facing away from the road, but they each had a ramp underneath that led in from the back. A Union Guard soldier peered out from underneath one of the craft. She looked skywards carefully to scout out aircraft with her own eyes, as if too paranoid to trust the craft's own senses before returning undercover. Some of the refugees stopped to watch, and a small crowd inched forward towards the craft. The Union Guard soldier appeared again and seemed to beckon the crowd to come in. Once again she looked skywards and then disappeared. The crowd surged in. After a few seconds it began to dissipate, carrying off various parts of the transport's modest inventory of food, water, boots and weapons. Paul looked away from the feed as his Dragonfly flew over what remained of Samuel Hoffman's compound. Their sister craft found a landing site, stirring up whirlwinds of black dust and embers. The heavy drone continued alongside Paul's craft. Paul and his troops watched from the windows. Fucking animals, one said. Well, they knew something we don't, another said, looking at Paul. Paul looked around and said, Our intel says the robot isn't a threat to us. Yet. Yes, well, one step at a time. The Dragonfly came alongside the enemy transports and landed, as the heavy drone menaced the area from above. Paul's unit poured out. The transports had been stripped bare, save for a dozen abandoned Union Guard uniforms. Nobody wanted those. Paul stared up and down the road. The steady flow of civilians gave him and his troops a wide berth, eyeing them nervously, but there was no immediate sign of panic. For fear or favour, those who managed to acquire weapons rarely had any desire to use them against the front. The people here were simply looking out for themselves. They found the robot a couple of minutes later, inert. Someone had dragged it a short distance down the road before giving up. It was very badly damaged. Circuitry and wiring splayed from apparent shrapnel and bullet wounds all over. It gave the impression of having once looked human, though its face was dangling off the side of its head like a torn rubber sheet, and other parts of its exterior were missing altogether. It had been dressed up in rough civilian clothing, now burnt and torn. Test it for explosives and anything else, and then bring it in, Paul ordered, pointing to the 2 soldiers who'd found it. They nodded and set to work. Odysseus, his earpiece blared. It was the other team back at the compound. We've found the robot, I think. Paul spun around and stared at the humanoid mechanical wreckage. He ran a hand through his hair, sighed, and chuckled to himself. Acknowledged, he replied. Keep it safe. We'll be there soon. Paul's troops hauled their robot back to the Dragonfly. Onlookers backed away across the road as all 3 craft took off. The Union transports are now the front's property. They landed soon after at the ruined compound, encircled by a wide area of smouldering blackened ground and a broken mesh fence. Of the compound itself, only small segments of the outer wall still survived. Fires burned inside among the debris, and beyond the fence in the dense surrounding foliage. Paul and his unit stepped out onto scorched earth. An entire village within the walls had been annihilated. Metal, wood, masonry had been blasted everywhere, and bodies, burnt, dismembered, uniformly lifeless. Everywhere there was an indistinct cocktail of smells that might be burning human flesh. And just above the noise of the hovering drone, there was crying. From behind a tiny corner section of the exterior wall came a voice incoherent with loss and misery. Paul stopped for a moment at the sound. The troops from the other dragonfly were dispersed around the area, standing guard. God, you've got to be kidding. He hurried around the corner to find a young woman, alive, sitting awkwardly on a broken concrete slab, wailing, trembling, terrified, and looking around aimlessly, almost oblivious to the troops. She'd doubtless been a witness to the massacre of everyone else and left for dead herself. She seemed mostly unhurt, with only minor cuts on her face and arms, but her clothes were as torn and blackened as those of any of the bodies. Paul stared, unable to face the logical conclusion. Lieutenant Deborah Hall stood nearby, solemn, holding one of the crude devices given to them by the Resistance, a robot detector. It was a small, rounded plastic box. Deborah handed it to him. She must have tried it herself already. This is wrong. Paul cringed at the pathetic figure huddled in the ash, evoking the raw face of humanity. He knew how the device worked, roughly. He approached the woman, who looked up with a face divided between rage and despair. Silently now, she allowed him to kneel down in front of her. He reached out to her with the device and pressed it against her unprotesting arm. The detector had electrical contacts with which it could connect to the robot's tactile network interface. Nothing happened. The woman glared at him. He eventually withdrew the device, feeling foolish but somehow relieved. "I'm sorry," he said, shaking his head and letting out more feeling in his voice than he intended. He clasped the woman's hands without really knowing what else to do. She gripped his hands tightly in return, the look on her face subtly different, less adversarial. He let go and began to stand up, but the woman seized his arm. She reached out and touched the underside of the device. It sounded immediately and displayed the result Paul had feared. "Take care of them," she said in a quivering, barely audible voice. She flashed Paul a momentary, desperate smile. "We will," Paul said quickly before the reality had sunk in. The woman fell back to the ground, exhausting whatever temporary reserve of strength she'd found. She crumpled up and whimpered. Paul stepped back, staggering slightly. He tried the device against his own arm, willing it to commit a false positive, but nothing happened. "I think it's voluntary," Deborah said, watching him. "It won't detect her as a robot unless she wants it to." Deborah Hall met General Jeffrey Ryan, the Commander-in-Chief of the rebellion, in the hangar of the secure military technology facility at Darwin Airport. Standing alongside was Major Murray. It was clear that neither had much regard for the other's rank. They had been there from the very start, long before Port Moresby, as equal conspirators in the camps in central Papua. A small cordon of rebel soldiers formed around her troops and the Dragonfly as security for her two robots. Captain Cannon, meanwhile, was coordinating the grisly, low-tech finale to state-of-the-art weapons deployment, handling the bodies left behind. She saluted and glanced back at the hatchway. One of the soldiers helped the still functional robot climb out. Two more grasped the other by what was left of its limbs, hauling it down to the concrete ground. The woman, wrapped in a spare camouflage uniform jacket, stood next to Deborah, away from the wreckage. She had been mostly quiet for the flight. She hadn't even mentioned her name if she had one. But her face and her trembling body language had worked upon Deborah's mind as they sat facing each other. She had her arms folded now, not daring to look at anyone, and glanced briefly at the humanoid mass of mangled circuitry next to her. "This is her?" Major Murray asked Deborah, gesturing to the intact robot. Deborah nodded, and Murray approached. The robot grabbed Deborah's arm, as if for comfort. Deborah tensed, but didn't move. "She says the other one was a decoy. I'll get Ding Zhang to look at it." "This is not what I expected," General Ryan said. Murray didn't reply, but knelt down to try to catch the robot's gaze. "Hello." The robot returned her stare reluctantly, seeming to fight back tears. I need to wash myself," she said abruptly. "Please." "I'm going to leave you to it," Ryan said. "Anything you decide, you'll have my support." Morewe nodded without turning around and grasped the robot's shoulders. Her face was caked in soot from the incineration of everything and everyone around her. She looked back to Deborah. "This is Major Morewe," Deborah said. "She'll take care of you." "Come on," Morewe said softly. She took the robot's hand and led her away through the cordon. Kasi, her name was. Lasana Morewe stood restive outside a shower cubicle, holding a towel, as the anthropomorphic machine washed herself. Kasi Hoffman. Kasi regarded Samuel Hoffman as her father. She'd lost her entire family, perhaps everyone she'd known. There was a knock on the outside door. Ding Xiang peered inside and beckoned Lasana out into the corridor. "She's right," he said. "It's a piece of junk. I think it may have had part of the same physical design as the other one, but there's too much missing. A lot of the wiring doesn't really connect to anything, but it gets your attention, and that's the point." Lasana nodded. "Well, obviously that was the easy one. What do you think about this one?" "Yes, I have a thought. Ask her when she was uploaded." "From where? Oh, I see. You don't think she's really a robot?" "Mechanically, maybe, but that's not the hard part. The hard part is the brain. I bet it's a lot easier to copy an existing human mind than to re-engineer one from scratch, if you're going for the simpler theory." Lasana nodded and patted Ding Zhang's shoulder, then returned to her post. The water was still running, but it had been a while now. Lasana forced the door open and saw Kasi sitting on the floor with her legs tucked into her arms, silent, water streaming around her. Her clothes lay across from her, a pile of burnt rags. She still wore a simple necklace. Next to her clothes were several metal shards, shrapnel. Kasi herself had pulled them out, and Lasana now saw deep gashes in her shoulder and waist from where one or two must have come. They were bloodless, despite the bright red colour. There was some exposed wiring in her shoulder. Lasana turned the tap off and knelt down slowly, bringing the towel around Kasi. "Does it hurt?" she asked. She ran a finger gingerly over Kasi's shoulder. Kasi flinched. Lasana hoped the water in the wound wasn't going to cause a problem. "I think I'm okay," Kasi said after a moment. "It was so fast. I didn't know what was happening." Her voice was flat, but unmistakably human. She stared ahead, quietly, blankly, a veneer of emotional control reforming, masking whatever was going on inside. "You used to be human?" Lasana asked. Kasi turned to face her briefly, but said nothing. "You weren't always like this, were you?" Lasana persisted. Kasi maintained her silence. Lasana was about to give up when Kasi took a deep breath. "I had an accident a long time ago." "So they put you in that body?" Kasi nodded slowly. "I was burnt all over. They couldn't save me except Dad was working on this project." "How long ago?" 3 years. I was 13. God, you're just a girl. Your body looks older. Dad said I grow into it. So your brain... I don't want to talk about it." Okay, we don't have to talk about it." Turing proof, Lasana thought. The Turing test, as explained by the Resistance, since officially sanctioned articles on the subject were largely incoherent, was a very loose idea or set of ideas for judging the humanness of a machine. If, under questioning, a machine was indistinguishable from a human, did its true nature really matter? Kasi ought to pass it without even trying, for reasons that now seemed rather obvious. If she hadn't volunteered that she wasn't entirely human, they may never have known. Lasana reached out and stroked the girl's tangled and matted black hair and was taken aback by the texture. She leaned closer to see. Previously hidden by the dust and ash, there were a few lumps of fused plastic where Kasi's hair had partly melted together in the blast. Lasana ran her fingers around Kasi's sullen, unprotesting face to check for more damage, but found none. Kasi's skin, though supple, was clearly very strong. Lasana reached for Kasi's necklace to examine it. There was a pendant, a tiny silver candle with a golden flame. It was a very last material possession. "I made it years ago," Kasi murmured. Lasana let go and Cassie wrapped her hand around it, her knuckles turning white. Hope, Lysana realized. Something had driven the girl to make a physical symbol of hope to carry with her, even before this catastrophe. Something. Being burnt alive and remade as a machine might easily qualify. Lysana reached back behind the door to retrieve a neatly folded bundle of fresh clothes, including the innocuous, baggy, dull blue uniform worn by the rebel army officers. She placed them on a dry shelf and retreated back through the door. And that is chapter 1.